So this session is Women of Consequence. We have two speakers, Kalpana, Karunakaran, and Nazia Akhtar, and the session is being moderated by Suneetha A. Kalpana Karunakaran is an associate professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, IIT Madras. Her research and writings are in the domain of gender, labor, microcredit, women's trade unions, and solidarity-based movements. She writes about women's lives with a focus on the intersections of the personal and the political. She's the author of Women, Microfinance, and the State in Neoliberal India 2017, the Tamil memoir Comrade Amma, Magal Parvai, Maithili Shivaraman, Comrade Mother, a daughter's portrait of Maithili Shivaraman 2018, and A Woman of No Consequence, Memory, Letters, and Resistance in Madras 2025. Our next speaker is Nazia Akhtar, who teaches courses in Indian and Russian literatures at IIT Hyderabad. She received grants from the Charles Wallace India Trust and has held fellowships with the New India Foundation and the Academy Schloss Solitude to write 2 books on a long tradition of Urdu writing among women in Hyderabad. Her translation of Zeenat Sajida's Urdu short story, Chotam Jaan, received a commendation from the jury of the Jawad Memorial Prize 2021. Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women and 20th Century Urdu Prose 2022 was her first book, and her second book, The Deccan Sun, Essays and Stories by Zeenat Sajida 2025 consists of translations of Urdu writings. Our moderator is Suneetha A., who is an independent researcher who works on gender, minority, violence, and law. Her recent book, Faith and Democracy, Muslim Political Discourse in the Telugu Region 2025, is co-authored with M.A. Moid. She's an avid translator of theory from English to Telugu and short stories from Telugu to English. She translated Bell Hooks' Feminism is for Everybody as Andarike Strivadam 2025. She works with Maidanam, a blog that discusses the culture, history, and politics of the Deccan. Over to you, ma'am.
Hi, can you hear us? Yeah. So, welcome you all to this wonderful session. I'm delighted to be with 2 women who I respect and who have read and followed their work, and it's a privilege to be actually moderating this session. As I was just telling them before the session, we were planning how the session would work, and I was telling them that I had just finished reading Sheikh Mahbub Basha's Scripting a New Gender Politic, which is based on women's journals in colonial Andhra. And I followed up reading these 2 books, and it's as if 2 of the characters from full-fledged lives I could get to read. I mean, that is colonial Andhra, and Kalpana's is on Tamil Nadu, and Nazia's is in Hyderabad state. But the feelings, emotions, and the expressions and articulation of these women across these geographies is so similar and so relatable to contemporary women's studies scholars and women, actually. So I thought that this session would have more of a general audience, but I see a lot of friends here, women's studies scholars and friends. So we could probably have all the questions if you stick to your time. We have 40 minutes time, and at 40 minutes I have to stop and open the session to the audience. So we have arrived at 5 questions, and some are generic because session is common. Whoever wants to go, please go. So the first question that we have is that, can you say something about the journey towards the book? It's linked to your previous writing or research, publications, or any other linkages. You want to go? She's the guest. She's from Chennai. This one. It just...
Hello? Yeah. I must begin with a confession that I intended to write a book, but this is not the book I intended to write. The book that I wrote, A Woman of No Consequence, is a book that was entirely accidental. So I have to give you a little bit of a flashback or a background. The book I intended to write, I wanted to write, was about the life of my mother, Maithili Sivaraman. Many of you here may have heard her name. She was quite a force to reckon with in left politics nationally and in politics generally in the state of Tamil Nadu. She was very active with women's movements, trade unions, with the Kisan movement, and for about 4 decades had been writing about and leading from the front lines anti-caste movements. Was active in class politics and women's movements. So she was clearly a woman of consequence, right? And I had a frenzy to write about her because she was losing her memory to Alzheimer's. She no longer had a sense of who she was or of what kind of a life she had been leading. And therefore, I felt it was my moral duty to tell the world who she had been. So I was looking for material in my house, right? When I found this wooden box in which Maithili's mother, my grandmother, Maithili's mother's name is Pankajam. Pankajam is the subject of my book, my maternal grandmother. So she had left for me a wooden box in which she had written on the cover in her handwriting, my writings for Kalpana. And inside that box, I found something that entirely took my breath away. See, I knew that my grandmother was interested in writing, right? She used to write poetry, she used to write romantic stories, essays, etc. And all of it she would press on us to read as her grandchildren. But what I found when I opened that wooden box was her autobiography that I realized that she had been writing for close to 50 years. She had begun it in 1949, just 2 years after, well, post-independence. And the last piece was in 1994. All of it was in English. It was in the school and college essay notebook. So some of my graph books also, the X graph, Y graph, all that was also part of this. All of it was written longhand, and it was written in, fits and bursts. It was not a linear, smooth, or straightforward writing, but she'd been writing for over 50 years. And in this writing, she says very clearly, who am I to write? How dare I write? I'm a housewife. I'm an utterly ordinary woman. I've managed a large house with many children. She had 5 children, lots of cows in the shed, and then grandchildren after that. And I have really nothing, she says in her foreword. I'm not a society lady, and I'm not a woman of our time of national struggle. So that's 1949. And yet, I have a story to tell. So I realized as I read her writing that this was not what we understand as journaling today, right? Which is cathartic. You put your thoughts down. It's a way of relieving or unburdening yourself, because she wanted to be heard. She clearly says, now my reader, let me tell you what happened. So then she's inviting you into a world that she constructs for herself. And reading her writing, I began to recognize that while she calls herself repeatedly a Sarva Sadharana Kudumba Penmani, she writes in Tamil as well, by the way, a very ordinary woman, she was far from ordinary, and she had in fact led an extraordinary life. So I knew that this was the book that I had to write, even if it was very different from the life of political fights and going to jail and social movements, which my mother, Maithili's life had been all about.
I think that's just yours. Yeah. So, unlike Kalpana, I did set out to write this very book. And I think I've always believed that books beget books. So I think my first book, which was a wider survey of Hyderabadi women's writings in Urdu, specifically prose in the 20th century, had led me to collect a lot of material and to do a lot of research, which I could then not include in that particular book. And, and it had also, because I was so struck by what I had found, that there was this long tradition beginning in the 19th century of women's writings that had been published in periodicals that were later printed as books. This profusion of texts across genres, fiction, non-fiction, which no one seemed to know about, mainly because they were in Urdu and they had been written by women. So and I was drawn in particular to this figure. There were so many other writers, and I am working on many of those other writers. But the reason I decided to focus on Zinat Sajida is because her essays were just sparkled with wit and with intelligence and with insight that seemed to be far ahead of her time. And she seemed to be, writing about things in a way that I had never seen before, I situate her, I think, within a larger progressive writer's moment, but we'll come to that later, perhaps. The other thing, I think, the urgency in writing this book stemmed from the fact that we don't know a lot about Urdu non-fiction. I mean, the genres that have high cultural capital and visibility when it comes to Urdu literature tend to be the novel, the ghazal, maybe the short stories. And, there is a different trajectory where the ghazal is concerned. Both, I think, the classical and the revolutionary ghazal in Urdu have canonical status and have a lot of cultural capital associated with them that is independent of English and perhaps the colonial encounter. But when it comes to the Urdu novel and Urdu short stories, I think they come about as a specific encounter between the colonial moment and a lot of influences that came from the West, as well as what was existing in Indian storytelling tradition. So things like the dastan and qissa and kahani. But things that, so for instance, the Urdu khaka. So what you will see in this, in the book that I am here to talk about today, The Deccan Sun, are translations of Zinat Sajida's khake and inshaiye. These are two genres of essays. And the khaka in particular, I think, comes to us from a Perso-Arabic genre called tazkira, which doesn't have the same trajectory as, say, the development of the novel or the short story in Urdu. And so there are possibilities there to think of history and literature in ways that are different from the templates that we are accustomed to. And this book was very difficult to sell to a publisher, and my agent kept telling me that this is going to be difficult to sell. It was very difficult to sell. We had interest only from one publisher, and that's the one that we went and published with, because there was no existing market for translations of Urdu essays. So we decided to go ahead with this book. I felt for that reason it was urgent to do it, and I stubbornly stuck to my guns and said, we will publish this book, because apart from the themes and the author, it's the genre that needs more attention.
I'm glad you went ahead. I remember you had shared draft of one story some 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, for an informal session with Muslim women in the old city, actually. You were working on, obviously, the book. And of course, I just love the translations. And so the next question that I want to ask is around, which is specific to each of your book. Kalpana, as a historian, why do you think ordinary women should be written about? Because history is always already about extraordinary people. And usually men, sometimes women also get added. So why should we know about ordinary women?
Once again, let me... Hello? Yeah, I think this is working. So then maybe Suni, I'll answer your question in Pankajam's own words. Sometime in the 1960s, she says, why, and she goes back to this question of why am I writing? So I think she's trying to tease it out inside her own head. She can't quite believe that she's writing. Who is she to write? How dare she write? Those themes keep recurring in her writing. So then she says, if I don't write about the utterly ordinary life that I have led, it is really only I who can, I by I she means women like her, who have no access to the public domain, who can talk about the lives of women and families and domestic arrangements. Because otherwise, all the stories we know, she says, she writes, would be about kings and princes and wars and politics. And clearly this is all way before in history what we now know as the turn to subaltern, that subaltern school of history writing, in which there was a great deal of methodological focus also on how to retrieve, recover and write histories from below of non-elite sections of the population, whether they are peasants or they are tribes or they are women from households who have had no access to either formal literacy or the capacity to enter the public domain or the public realm, etc. How do we then capture those voices, those histories, and are those stories not worth telling, right? And for me, again, this is interesting, and I think this is a slight biographical detail about Pankajam, the subject of my book that I have to add here, which is that she had about 6 years of school life before she was withdrawn, no more than 6 years, to be married off the next year. So when she was about 16 years old, in the middle of class 9, she's pulled out of school life. But she has a long essay, which I have in the book, which is on how she experienced a classroom of girls, high-spirited girls, in the Lady Willingdon School and Training College of Madras Presidency then. It's one of the early pioneering schools for girls' education. So the fact that we are using the writing in this case of a schoolgirl, right, from the 1920s, tells us, gives us again this vantage point, this very interesting counter vantage point, because otherwise we have all the voices of the social reformers, educationists. Annie Besant was a very influential writer in the Madras Presidency, and of course, theosophist, etc., all of you know her, who championed the movement for girls' schooling, along with Subramanya Bharati. And all of them write about how the whole agenda is to produce dutiful mothers who are going to beget the next generation. Yes, of patriotic, dutiful children, right? They shouldn't be like fickle Western women. No, 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 that's not the purpose of education. But because you have this schoolgirls writing, you look at how Pankajam uses her experience of schooling for those 6 precious limited years in ways that are completely a striking contrast to the prescriptions of these educationists. So it gives you that vantage point to look at this celebrated agenda of, let's say, girls' schooling. To give you another, just one example I'll add, what about conjugality, right? Because she's writing, and here I want to add that she also writes what I call autofiction in this book. It's her story, but she can't, it's too painful to say, look, all this happened to me. So she says, this is Kamala's story, Meena's story, and Lakshmi's story. And this Kamala, Meena, and Lakshmi, who are they? They're all Pankajam. But because she writes then, through this distancing strategy, she's able to write very raw, graphic accounts of conjugal life in all its messiness, right? And reading it, I was taken aback and realized that how would we know what happened in the bedroom, right? Were it not for women like Pankajam, who wrote using Kamala's voice and Lakshmi's voice to tell us what the bedroom looked like in 1930s and 1940s, right? So that's, again, a way of answering your question, Suni.
Nazia is, as a literary critic, teacher of literature, where would you place Zina Sajida's writings in 20th century Urdu literature?
So I think she fits in very well within a larger tradition of progressive writing, north or south. I mean, I don't like such yardsticks, but she has been compared to Ismat Chughtai. I think that's limiting in some ways. And I remember one very senior Urdu scholar, whom I will not name, who told me this, that Zina Tapa used to write just like Isma Tapa, except that Isma Tapa was very embarrassing to read. You know, Zina Tapa at least, you know, prevented us the embarrassment of reading about, you know, reading about sex, for instance, or worse, about lesbians, right? So, so that's, but I think in terms of the fearlessness of her writing, in terms of the innovation of the things she was writing about, the ideas that she was bringing out, you know, an essay like Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, or, you know, another essay which is हम हैं तो अभी राह में है संग गिरा और, which has been translated in the book as so long as I exist, there will be obstacles in my path, which is so, you know, which deals with things like the mental load of women, which deals with things like, gender privilege, which deals with so many things that we are talking about today and that we think are very current issues, but were being debated by her in the 1940s and the 1950s. I mean, she, spoke about such things that, we hesitate to talk about even today. So for instance, she addressed questions of, say, incestuous relationships. There's an essay called If I Were a Man, which is deliberately very provocative. Then there's a whole series of essays that she writes on the follies of the middle class. She like Isma Chughtai, who for different reasons was definitely part of the Progressive Writers Association, the Progressive Writers Movement, but like Ismat and Manto, who were somewhat sidelined and somewhat seen as problems to be kept on the margins, she's not a quote-unquote typical socialist writer writing about socialist themes, right? Because as we know, the Progressive Writers Association moved on to have two wings, one which was card-carrying socialist writing, dealing specifically head-on with things like class struggle, but there were, and which expected to see that. But there were other people who were doing other kinds of things creatively and who wanted that creative freedom to do it. Ismat and Manto, I think, fell somewhat in that category, and Aisha Jalal talks very nicely about it in her book on Manto. Zeenat Sajida, however, in spite of not writing about the standard progressive tropes and ideas, falls squarely within the progressive writing milieu in Hyderabad. Because in Hyderabad, the progressive writing platform was very useful for women who wanted to write, because it had been so broadly defined. So if you were writing, it was a great platform to be published and heard. So I think, and in terms of both her ideological bent, she said once upon a time that, I don't think my left politics runs contrary to my Muslim faith. And she was a practicing Muslim. She prayed 5 times a day. She was jailed after police action, and the police were very confused to find this woman with her head covered, devoutly reading the Quran, and because they had expected a very fearsome communist. And here was this woman. But she didn't see that as contrary at all, because she said that Islam advocates for justice. And I think, and this was her view, that left-wing politics is the way towards that. And so her ideological bent was that. And you see that in her writing, not perhaps in, like I said, standard socialist, paths, but in a different perspective, let's say, and a specific innovation towards both theme and form.
The question that I have for you, Kalpana, is what are the difficulties, what did you face? What difficulties did you face while writing about your grandmother? You are a historian, and historian is supposed to be objective. And here you are, digging into family archives, digging into your uncle's biographies, autobiographies, and various kinds of sources that are so close to you. Like, your cousins, your, uncles, almost every correspondence. So, does it make it less objective?
Maybe one detail that I should add here is that, in a sense, even here, my mother Maithili has walked the path before I did. Because one of the last things she did in the years before she lost her memory, not the last years of her life, she passed away only recently, last years of her active life, intellectually and politically active life, one of the last things that she did was to write a book on the life of her maternal grandmother, who happens to therefore obviously be Pankajam's mother, right? Pankajam's mother's name was Subbalakshmi, who was yet another unknown woman. And what Maithili does in her book is to kind of show how the grandfather whom she loves can turn out to be the villain of a story in which the protagonist is the grandmother who was difficult to love. So Subbalakshmi was Maithili's grandmother, but was not a grandmother who would pick up and cuddle and tell stories and sing lullabies and put you to sleep and feed a child or show any kind of physical demonstration, because that was just not who she was. She was always reserved, distant, unemotional, and very inward looking, right? And but Maithili adored her grandfather, and he turns out to be the villain of the story of her grandmother's life. And I think, in a sense, she's walked that path before me, I should say. Here, I think I also used a distancing strategy, because likewise, I loved my grandfather. I still love him. He happens to be a great villain in this book, as you will see. Although, I hope you're also able to see that nobody is really a villain. Everybody, all the men, have shades of grey in them, as many of the women do as well. Right? But one thing I do is to very consciously never say that Amma, Pati, mother, grandmother, this is Lalita, Ram, Srinivasan, Sivaraman. So these are characters, right? So this distancing strategy allows me also to say things that have been difficult for me to write about. But I realized, and as you will also realize when you read the book, that some parts of it are quite raw. And those parts were, and I did think about, well, okay, so these are the unpleasant, unsavory skeletons rattling around in the family's closet. How many of them should I expose to the light of, well, to sunlight? And then I realized that all these details and then some more were in Pankajam's stories, in the autofiction. So then I felt that if she leads, now I have to follow. I can't shy away from doing this. I think subjectivity, the way I handle it is to say, I show you my hand. I can't, and I don't anywhere claim, look, my grandmother, right? So I know how it happened. No, I don't know how it happened, because who knows how anything happens, right? I say, these are my sources. Look at this letter. But then I remember this. But then I remember my mother told me this. But then I interviewed my uncle. But then I read her autofiction, which now says what the autobiography doesn't say. So right through the story, I weave all this in. And I hope you, the reader, if you pick up the book, I hope you'll become the reader. I hope you can also quarrel with me and say that you don't interpret her life the way I do. You may see another Pankajam from the one that I have laid out before you, because I lay out my sources also, and you're free to interpret her in the light of the memories you might have about the female ancestors in your families, right? So therefore, I think it becomes possible to tell a story that might otherwise be too uncomfortably close to where one lives. So.
I have one question for us. Yeah. So, in your translator's note, Nazia, you discuss some of the liberties that you took while translating Zina Sajida's writings. Can you share some of these with listeners and tell us more? Like, what are the, how do you translate a text like her, a woman like her, who is also little distant in time, and also wrote for somebody, a different time, literally. So how do you translate her for contemporary audience, readers?
I think all translators face the dilemma of whether to, of allegiance. So whether to be faithful to the text that you're translating or to be faithless to it. And what I have learned after a lot of agony, after 10 years of doing this, is that in order to be faithful, you have to be faithless. Because if you are faithful and you translate word for word, you will make a mockery of the text. In two languages that are so dissimilar, right? Urdu and English is the language pair that I'm talking about. If you translate word for word, you will end up with something that's a caricature of the source, that is not readable, and that doesn't in any way do justice to that text or to the reader for whom you are translating, to the author, to yourself. So I think in some ways you have to make that text your own, and you have to find ways of translating it um, and arrive at a very delicate balance. I call it, in the translator's note I've said, being a translator is like being in permanent suspension. And that's what I mean by that, that you're constantly going back and forth and you're constantly unsure about, it's constantly, I mean, I think a translation is constantly in a state of becoming. And so I mean, to give you, an example, there are a lot of English words in some essays that Sajida writes, and these are very strategically used. She's trying to evoke a certain, shift in culture, the way the young talk, or she's trying to use certain words, to make fun of a certain segment, as satire, for instance, social satire. So, what do you do with those words? I mean, do you let them be? Do you italicize them? Do you mark them out in some way? So that was a challenge. So and I've dealt with that differently in every time it has happened, depending on the context. In some cases, I have italicized them so that the sarcasm comes out, and I hope that the reader reads with that emphasis, which is intended with that emphasis. Then there are other things like, I mean, there are these wonderful moments when you come across some idiom which translates beautifully into English, either literally, or you find an equivalent for it. And, I'm trying to, I can quote if I can find them, but I can't think off the top of my head now. But so the things where I have, I think, taken considerable liberties with, I'm not too worried about the phrases or the idioms that she uses, because I think I've done justice to them. But where I felt I was really being very adventurous is actually the form of her, like the visual form of her work as it appears on the page. So orthographical markers, for instance, commas and full stops and things like that, these are a distinctly, I wouldn't say Anglophone, but I would say Western tradition, right? Orthographical markers don't work in the same way in our languages, and they certainly don't work that way in Urdu. So Zinat Sajida's, essays are long, breathless paragraphs, and it's also there to show the energy and the speed of her thought and the intensity of her thought. Now, I had to break some of these down and introduce punctuation and play with punctuation in a manner that suggests that cascading thought. Because otherwise, for an English reader, it would be totally unreadable. We are not used to reading like that in English. And even if I want to train my reader, even if I want to transport my reader into the world of Urdu, my English reader into the world of Urdu, which is in some ways my intention, I don't think it should work the other way around. Even then, it's too much. So you're risking, again, making a mockery out of the source if you don't do that. So I don't know if this helps. I haven't given any concrete examples, but this is the tips.
So we have 7 minutes before we open up the session. Let's see if we can do this. So what is the favorite part of your book? Kalpana, in your book, I personally like Pankajam's address to Singapore radio. Wow, in 1960? So Pankajam's address to Singapore radio when she visits Singapore, 65 or 67, huh? Yeah. And Nazia, I of course loved Makhdoom's portrait. I mean, nobody can not like it. It gives the true sense of who Makhdoom was and who Makhdoom, continues to be for many people in Hyderabad. So what is your favorite parts of the book? And maybe 2 minutes you can spend on reading it.
I won't read it. I didn't come prepared to read it, but that's no matter. So I think something that it was hard for me, it's still hard for me to isolate one section that is my favorite, because I also fell in love with her writing, the quality of her writing, and I found that there's this lovely, what we in anthropology call thick description, right? So there's immersive description of landscapes, of people, of social relationships. So when she talks about, she lived the first several years of her life in very remote, far-flung, tiny seaside villages in the coast, along the Coromandel coast of Madras Presidency then, as it was, when there was nobody for miles and miles. And she would write about the life of the coast, the life of the countryside, her mother's melancholia. And it's a child, and she would write like a child that is looking at the world of adults, right? And looking at the father's violence against the mother slowly unraveling. And all of this becomes part of the atmospheric quality of the writing. So it's a mood in which she is constantly writing. And even the autofiction, I found that it's not just cathartic writing. It's not because all these painful things happen to me, I have to put it in paper. It is because she's still the writer. She's observing the world around her, and she's in love with language. And she's telling us what it meant to be a 17-year-old in the late 1920s and to want a man, to desire a man, to find a partner, to find a companion, etc. So it's kind of hard for me to find that one single part, but maybe it would be the part where much later in life, she goes off by herself she travels the world, she goes to the UK, right? And she writes of herself as a woman with no money, no time, and no freedom, right? A condition perhaps that echoes, that resonates. So then the question is, what is she doing in the UK all by herself? But you'll have to read it to find out. But you'll find out that she's almost stranded there. Just by herself, she figures out how to use the tube, how to make her way, how to live alone in a little flat, and to spend about 3 weeks doing that, and then helping other tourists who are losing their way in the tube, right? So maybe that was my favorite part of the book.
I think I would have found it as hard as Kalpana to isolate one moment that I want to read from the book, but I think Suneetha's made it easier for me by telling me which her favorite essay is. So just for context, this is a speech that Zeenat Sajida delivered on the occasion of Jashn-e Makhdoom in 1969, on the occasion of Makhdoom's 60th birthday. Makhdoom Mohyuddin was a very famous revolutionary poet, for those who are not aware of who he was. And they were very good friends. So the way she's written this essay is, there is a reason why it's considered a classic in Hyderabad. Makhdoom is a scoundrel. See, it has been many years since I asked him to write a ghazal so that I can recite it at a mushaira and receive an ovation. As you know, poets are showered with wah wah, subhanallah, irshad, irshad, and other forms of praise and applause. So naturally, my heart is bound to be tempted. Makhdoom immediately agreed to give me his new composition. But the state of things is such that as the sher materializes, word by word, he begins to recite it to people. A quarter of a line, half a line, 3/4 of a sher, and then the complete sher. He recites it at every stage. If there is no one around him, he will make them listen to it over the phone. If he does not find any listeners over the phone, he will go to people's houses. He will get a mortgage to pay for a rickshaw if he has to go somewhere to find listeners. Then he will embezzle the money as well as recite the sher. If he cannot find a good listener, he will stop someone in the streets and recite to him. In fact, seeing Makhdoom, the man will himself stop to listen. He will recite his sher to the rickshawala, to waiters in hotels, and even little children. In short, before he completes a ghazal or a nazm, he will recite it to hundreds of people repeatedly. His poetry is a contagious disease. His listeners will recite it to others, and in this way, the Hyderabadi public memorizes his compositions like parrots. So everyone knows the new ghazal verbatim before it comes to me. Tell me then, what do I call him if not a scoundrel? It is easy to steal from Mir's writings because it is entirely possible that no one will find out. Mir is a very famous canonical Urdu poet. But if you steal even half a sher by Makhdoom and recite it to someone else, the listener responds with the other half and says, "Isn't Makhdoom's poetry wonderful?"
It's working now. Yeah, the session is open for questions. Yeah, please raise your hand and she will come to you and yeah. Huh.
Hi, both of you. It was a pleasure to listen to you and your stories. I just have a small question regarding the history of the extraordinary women, the ordinary women like Pankajam. Don't you think there is a bias towards women who have some literacy in their life? And what about maybe that literacy makes them extraordinary? And what about the people who still, like Pankajam had 6 years of education at that time, and now also it's not very common parlance to say that every woman in India does have that. So don't you think that that makes them extraordinary and their stories are more punctuated in the society than the ones who are not at all given the opportunities for education?
Can the people who are asking questions just say who you are? Like,
Oh,
just one.
introduce ourselves. Okay, my name is Sudhakar. I am historical fiction in Telugu. But the point I would like to raise with both the speakers is it's a good feeling to translate someone who's close to you, your family, a member of your own family. There's a sense of what do you call debt, repaying of debt, because I also had gone through a similar situation. But the challenge is, how do you think the current generation will receive this kind of non-fiction writing? Fiction is something else. Fiction is different. Okay, this is a non-fiction writing, and I'm puzzled as to how the current generation, contemporary generation, younger generation, would receive, and how do you think they'll be able to connect to this kind of writing?
Any other questions? We'll take 3 and stop. There.
Can you also discuss more on the story you were telling, like how can religion be used to spread the message of social justice and help women in getting that? Because we have seen a lot of times that religion is often used to oppress women, but as you were telling in your story that she used religion as a way of social justice to spread her ideas of improving women's lives. So can you discuss more on that? It will be really insightful.
Yeah, now you can.
So just to clarify, Zinat Sajida is not using religion itself to talk about social justice. I think she talks about what, there is one particular essay which I had referred to called Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote. This was published in 1946. Okay, so you can understand what a powerful moment it must have been to write something like that. Now, it is to the credit of Hyderabadis, I think that no one created a controversy over it, no fatwas were issued, right? Because everyone saw it as something called a hamd. A hamd is either praise poetry or something like that, maybe even in this case it can be said to be prose, written in praise of Allah. Okay? They saw it as a woman's perspective on Allah. Okay? So I don't think she's using religion, but she's not using religion to talk about social justice, but she's talking about her experiences as a woman. And this essay, by the way, is not limited to the experiences of Muslim women. She's talking about women in general and what they suffer at the hands of God and believer, and you know, what a God who is a mother can or should look like. Okay, so we have to be clear with these distinctions. Okay, I'm not. You know, it's very easy to put people in brackets and say, oh, this is an Islamic feminist or this is a feminist. I think these writers, and I think Kalpana will perhaps agree with me when it comes to the women in her own family, defy such isms and defy very, you know, these very broad brushstroke attempts to limit, or perhaps you know, that contain what they're doing or what they're trying to do. So yeah, so she's not using religion, but she's talking about her experiences as a woman and what it means to be a girl and a woman in the world, in Hyderabad, in the subcontinent, in the 1940s, between the 1940s and the 1980s.
Two questions. So yes, I agree with you that 6 years of education was definitely a luxury in the 1920s. And does it mean that, and what about the voices of those who did not have that education? Absolutely. And which is in a way, because I'm in the field of research, I know that there have been tremendous efforts in at least the last 20, 30 years to recover voices, women's experiences, experiences of subaltern groups through various means: folk stories, folk songs, oral narratives, archives, ways of restoring histories that do not privilege the written word, right? And that is of enormous importance. In fact, there have been very significant methodological advances there on how we might also read against the grain, right? Sometimes you have an official record, and the official record, you'll have to read what you have to read between the lines, you have to read against the grain. And then in terms, when it says thou shalt not, you shall not, you know that it's because that was happening, right? And that people were pushing back, which is why those laws had to be made. So there is an enormous body of writing. It could be sociology, it can be literature, it can be other fields, and of course history itself, that allows us very innovative and creative ways of recovering lives that appear to have been lost to us. I would certainly grant that. I would certainly concede that. There is no question of denying that. But I think what Pankajam's, the fact that she could read and write allows me to do. So, see, this is the interesting thing. Caste patriarchies in India have taken many different forms, right? And women have experienced caste patriarchies in very different ways, depending on where their social locations and the famous accident of birth has placed them, right? So in some cases, for instance, there have been tremendously rich archives of women from Maharashtra, for instance, in the Ambedkarite movements, many of whom have directly been inspired by Baba Saheb himself, and have Sharmila Rege's collections would also give you a way of reading, and many, many other autobiographies, testimonies, etc. But there have also then been cases where the hold of caste patriarchies have been so tight, and Pankajam belonged to, as I think I said in the beginning, a Tamil Brahmin family, orthodox therefore, which meant that the ability to move outside of to break free of the confines of family and domesticity was very limited. That was something Maithili, her daughter, did. That leap Maithili made. That leap Pankajam did not make. But Pankajam read and wrote. So that, as I hope to show in my next book, if I ever write it, Maithili may leap ahead and find other ways of expressing herself and crafting a politics. Thank you. Yes, sir, you had a question about contemporary generations of young people, or did you mean family members? Young people. How do they relate to non-fiction? Well, I think at least the feedback I've been getting from a lot of young women readers of this has been very, very heartening, very encouraging, very promising. Many of them felt that the writing uplifted them. They also felt that it was something that was immensely relatable. So I'm hopeful for narrative non-fiction of various kinds. I think narrative non-fiction is having its moment in India, right? So that's a form of writing I have a lot of personal faith in as well.
Do we have time for, no?
We can take one last.
Okay, one last question, apparently. Okay, there's one. You can ask later. Some person, yeah.
This is for Mrs. Kalpana Karunakaran. I really liked your book. I actually picked it up quite randomly at a Higgins Botham stall in Madras. So I was actually looking for a book I could read in a train. So I ended up reading A Woman of No Consequence. It was placed under Madras history, and I really like the title of Woman of No Consequence. I really find it powerful that a woman of no consequence can be worthy of a book. So that's the reason I bought your book, and I ended up reading it in the train entirely. I really liked the book. And what I wanted to ask was, the idea of journaling and actually maintaining diary entries in like early 1900s, was it a regular practice, or do you think your grandmother was like probably stood out among the lot, because it's very rare that we find documents about ordinary women or ordinary men or documenting their mundane lives, because there's hardly anything to document beyond on a daily basis. There's not solid material enough to document on a daily basis. So was it a regular practice back then? I mean, could you just elaborate on it?
Actually, I think there is a great deal of, there was that something to do with the colonial encounter as well, right? When women are given the means to read and write, they begin to write and how they write. There's a profusion of writing. It's almost as if, they found a voice, right? I think both Suneetha and both of you will agree with me that, that writing is something that, whether it takes the form of letters, journals, personal memoirs, etc., there's really a proliferation of women writing. Sometimes they're writing because their husbands are actually asking them to write as well, right? That can also happen. So there is that very interesting moment in history when certainly Pankajam was not the only woman who was writing, but for leads on who else was writing and what other kinds of literatures were also being around this period of time being produced and circulated, you will have to look at other books. I'm afraid I don't provide too many references in my own book, right? But I'm hoping that somebody after this, and it doesn't have to be me, but somebody else will pick up Pankajam's story and place it somewhere, situate it somewhere and say, these were women writing, and these are the ways in which Pankajam's voice overlaps, and these are the ways in which she is distinctive.
It's not a question, but I just wanted to add, I really liked how she saw life using literary references, like the reference to Jane Eyre or something like Little Women, and how literature served as a window to look at life of other women in other countries. I mean, how similar or dissimilar we are. I think that was my favorite part of the thing, that literature, even like in colonial times, even when the domestic life was so turbulent, she found literature as a source of hope. So I think that was my takeaway from your book. Thank you so much.
Do we have any time? No, I'm sorry. I mean, it's not in my hands. If it were in my hands, I also would have questions. Can we continue the conversation outside? Yeah? Thank you all for being wonderful audience, and thank you both of you for this wonderful books. Many, many congratulations, and thank you for writing it.